Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel Lifelong Language Lore. Before we begin today's lesson, please take a notebook and a pen. You may want to note down some important points from today's discussion. So let's get started. Today's topic is food and cultural studies. Today's lesson will focus mainly on Chapter 5, the National Diet, from the book Food and Cultural Studies. This book is written by Bob Ashley, Joanne Hollows, Steve Johns, and Ben Taylor, and it was published in 2004. To begin with, this book studies food from a cultural perspective. Rather than looking at food only as something we eat, it examines food as an important part of human life and society. Firstly, it explains how food shapes identity. The foods people eat often represent who they are, where they come from, and the traditions they follow. Secondly, the book discusses how food connects with culture and society. Food practices, cooking styles, and eating habits are deeply linked to cultural values and social relationships. Finally, it explores how food reflects history, class, and globalization, showing how social changes, economic conditions, and global influences affect what people eat and how food is produced and consumed. Before moving into the discussion of the national diet chapter, it is important to first understand the overall structure of the book. This helps us see how the ideas in the chapter fit within the broader discussion of food, culture, and society. The book contains 12 chapters. Overall, these chapters explore how food relates to culture, identity, media, and social practices. Firstly, the book begins with the chapter Food, Cultural Studies, Three Paradigms. This chapter introduces food as an important field of cultural study. It also discusses the key theoretical approaches used to study food within cultural studies. Secondly, the book moves to the chapter The Raw and the Cooked. This chapter is based on the ideas of Claude Lévi-Strauss. It explains how cooking transforms natural food into something cultural, showing that the act of cooking plays an important role in turning nature into culture. Moving on to the third chapter, Food, Bodies, and Etiquette. This chapter discusses table manners, body discipline, and the social behaviors associated with eating. It explains how societies developed rules about how people should eat, behave at the table, and control their bodies while eating. Next, the chapter Consumption and Taste explores how taste reflects class and cultural identity. In particular, it is influenced by the ideas of Pierre Bourdieu, who explains that people's food preferences often show their social class and cultural background. Here we come to the fifth chapter, the national diet, which we will discuss in detail. This chapter focuses on food and national identity. Specifically, it explains how countries construct and express their cultural identity through cuisine. Next, the sixth chapter, The Global Kitchen, discusses the globalization of food. In particular, it examines the spread of international cuisines and the emergence of hybrid food cultures across different societies. Moving on to chapter 7, Shopping for Food. This chapter examines supermarkets, consumer culture, and food marketing and explains how modern food shopping is influenced by advertising, branding, and consumer choices. Next, chapter 8, Eating In, focuses on domestic cooking and family meals. It also examines the gender roles involved in household cooking and how food preparation is often shaped by social expectations within the family. Chapter 9, Eating Out, explores restaurants, cafes, and the social meanings of dining outside the home. It explains how eating out is not only about food but also about social interaction, lifestyle, and cultural practices. Moving on to chapter 10, Food Writing. This chapter explores cookbooks, food journalism, and the literary representation of food, showing how food is discussed and interpreted through different forms of writing. Next, chapter 11, Television Chefs, explores the rise of celebrity chefs and cooking shows in media culture. It discusses how television and media have turned chefs into public personalities and made cooking a form of entertainment. Finally, Chapter 12, Food Ethics and Anxieties, discusses concerns about health, vegetarianism, and food safety. It also explores the moral debates and ethical questions surrounding what people choose to eat. For literature or cultural studies students, some important chapters include the raw and the cooked, consumption and taste, the national diet, food writing, and television chefs. Overall, these chapters help students understand how food functions as cultural symbol in text, media, and society. Now, let's discuss chapter 5, the national diet. First of all, this chapter explains how food becomes connected to a nation's identity. In other words, it shows how the food people eat can represent who they are as a nation. In particular, the chapter mainly talks about British food and culture. It explains how certain foods become symbols of national identity. For example, when people think about Britain, they often think of foods such as tea, fish, and chips, roast meat, and the English breakfast. As a result, these foods gradually become part of the idea of Britishness. Therefore, the chapter highlights that food is not only something people eat but also something that represents culture, tradition, and national identity. The opening example, Why Tea Matters. To begin with, the chapter opens with an interesting example about tea. In 1999, an Englishman named Brian Jones traveled around the world in a balloon. After successfully completing his journey, he was asked how he wanted to celebrate. Interestingly, his answer was simple. He said he wanted a good Englishman's drink, tea. This moment highlights something very important. In fact, tea is strongly connected to British identity. Moreover, this idea is not new. Even the famous writer George Orwell once wrote that tea is almost a symbol of British culture. Therefore, the author uses this example to show an important point. Food and drink are not just things people consume, they can also represent national identity and cultural belonging. What is a national diet? Next, the chapter explains the idea of a national diet. Simply put, a national diet refers to the group of foods that people believe represent a particular country. In other words, these foods become symbols of the nation's culture and identity. For example, when people think about Britain, several traditional foods often come to mind. These include the full English breakfast, roast beef, afternoon tea, fish and chips, and cakes and scones. However, it is important to note that people in Britain may not eat these foods every day. Nevertheless, they are still strongly associated with the country. Therefore, these dishes continue to symbolize Britain and play an important role in shaping the idea of British national identity. Why this idea is not so simple? However, the chapter also explains that the idea of a national diet is not always as simple as it seems. In fact, this concept can sometimes be misleading. To explain this, the chapter discusses two main problems. First of all, people do not actually eat these traditional foods every day. For instance, most British people do not regularly eat roast beef or a full English breakfast in their daily lives. Instead, these foods function more as cultural symbols than as everyday meals. Therefore, while these dishes are strongly associated with Britain, they do not necessarily reflect what people truly eat on everyday basis. Problem 2, food changes over time. In addition to this, the chapter points out another important problem. National diets do not stay the same forever. They change over time. In fact, historical developments and globalization have greatly influenced what people eat today. For example, many people in Britain now regularly eat foods such as pasta, pizza, curry, and Chinese dishes. As a result, modern eating habits have become much more international. Therefore, the idea of a fixed or purely traditional national diet becomes complicated because everyday food choices are increasingly shaped by global influences. Influence of culture and history. Furthermore, the chapter explains that food habits are strongly influenced by culture and history. In fact, what people eat often changes because of factors such as trade, colonial history, immigration, and globalization. For instance, Britain's colonial history played an important role in making tea popular in the country. As a result, tea eventually became an important part of British culture and daily life. Therefore, this example shows that national food traditions do not develop naturally on their own. Instead, they are shaped by historical events, cultural exchanges, and even political influences. Main idea of the chapter. Now let us move on to the main idea of this chapter. Overall, the chapter argues that food plays an important role in creating national identity. Certain dishes become closely connected with the image of a country and its culture. However, the author also points out that this idea is more complex than it first appears. In reality, food habits are constantly changing over time. Because of this, what we call a country's traditional food may not always be what people actually eat in their daily lives. Rather, these foods often function as cultural symbols that represent the nation. Thus, the chapter highlights that while food helps shape national identity, it is also dynamic, influenced by history, culture, and social change. To understand this idea more clearly, let us look at a simple example. For instance, think about India. If someone asks about Indian food, people might immediately mention dishes like biryani, dosa, or butter chicken. However, the reality is quite different. In everyday life, people in different regions of India eat very different types of food. For example, food habits in the south, north, east, and west of India can vary greatly. Therefore, the idea of Indian food is often a simplified cultural image rather than a complete picture of what people actually eat. In the same way, the concept of British food also works like this. Certain dishes represent the country symbolically, even though people may not eat them regularly in their daily lives. Key concepts from the chapter The National Diet. To begin with, one of the key concepts discussed in this chapter is national identity. In simple terms, national identity refers to the feeling of belonging to a particular country and sharing its culture, traditions, and symbols. In the context of this chapter, the authors explain that food plays an important role in creating this identity. For example, when people think about Britain, certain foods immediately come to mind, such as tea, fish and chips, and the English breakfast. Because of this strong association, these foods become closely linked with the image of Britain. Therefore, the key idea here is that food can help people feel connected to their nation and its cultural identity. Next, another important concept discussed in this chapter is the idea of a national diet. Simply put, a national diet refers to the group of foods that people believe represent a particular country. For instance, in the case of Britain, foods such as roast beef, afternoon tea, fish and chips, and scones and cakes are often seen as traditional British dishes. However, the chapter makes an important point here. In reality, people may not eat these foods every day in their daily lives. Nevertheless, these dishes continue to represent the country and its culture. Therefore, the key idea is that a national diet refers to the symbolic foods that are associated with a nation rather than the exact foods people eat regularly. Moving on, another important concept discussed in this chapter is cultural symbolism. In simple terms, cultural symbolism means that certain foods come to represent the culture of a particular country. For example, tea is often seen as a symbol of British culture. Similarly, sushi is closely associated with Japan, while pizza is commonly linked with Italy. Over time, these foods become more than just everyday meals. Instead, they begin to represent a country's tradition, lifestyle, and cultural identity. Therefore, the key idea here is that food can act as a powerful symbol of a nation's culture and identity. In addition, the chapter also connects food with the idea of an imagined community, a concept introduced by the political scientist Benedict Anderson. In simple terms, an imagined community refers to the idea that people in a nation feel connected to one another even though they do not personally know most of the other members of that nation. In this context, the chapter explains that shared food traditions can help create this sense of connection. For example, millions of British people drink tea every day. Even though they may never meet each other, this common habit creates a feeling of shared culture and belonging. Therefore, the key idea is that shared traditions such as common food habits can help people feel that they are part of the same nation. Next, the chapter also discusses the idea of authenticity. In simple terms, authenticity refers to something that is considered genuine, original, or truly traditional. For example, people often use expressions such as authentic British food, authentic Italian pizza. These phrases suggest that a dish represents the true and original food tradition of a country. However, the chapter points out that the idea of authenticity can be more complicated than it seems. This is because food cultures are not fixed. Instead, they continue to change and develop over time due to historical influences, cultural exchanges, and globalization. Therefore, the key idea is that authentic food is often what people believe to be traditional or original, even though food traditions themselves may have evolved over time. Moving on, the chapter introduces the concept of cultural construction. In simple terms, cultural construction means that many things in society are created and shaped through culture and social beliefs rather than being naturally fixed. In this context, the chapter explains that national food traditions are also culturally constructed. For example, fish and chips came to be recognized as typical British food through historical developments and cultural practices. It did not become British simply because it had always been eaten in Britain. Over time, cultural habits, social meanings, and shared beliefs helped establish this dish as part of British identity. Therefore, the key idea is that culture plays a major role in shaping what people think of as national food. Finally, another important concept discussed in the chapter is globalization and food. In general, globalization refers to the process through which cultures influence one another across different parts of the world. As a result, food habits today are no longer limited to one country or culture. Instead, people regularly eat dishes that come from many different parts of the world. For example, in Britain, foods such as Indian curry, Chinese dishes, and Italian pasta have become very common. Because of this global exchange of cultures, everyday eating habits have become much more diverse. To conclude, the chapter highlights an important idea about the relationship between food and culture. Food is not just something we eat to satisfy hunger, rather, it also plays a significant role in shaping cultural and national identity. Through shared food traditions, symbols, and everyday eating habits, people develop a sense of belonging to a particular culture or nation. Therefore, food becomes more than a basic necessity, it also reflects history, culture, and the identity of a society.